In 2005, two of the biggest companies on the planet made opposite bets on the future of flying. And only one of them was right. Airbus looked at the world and said, planes need to get bigger. Boeing looked at the same world and said, planes need to go farther. This is the story of how that single disagreement led to a $25 billion disaster for one side and a revolution in how the world flies for the other. Let's start with what Airbus was thinking because, honestly, it wasn't crazy. Their logic went something like this. Air travel is exploding, airports are running out of space, runways are packed, gates are full, and you can't just build new runways because neighbors complain. Environmental reviews take forever, and construction costs are insane. So the obvious solution? Build a plane so massive that you move more people per flight instead of adding more flights. That plane was the A380, double-decker, 850 seats in some configurations, the largest commercial aircraft ever built. And on paper, it made perfect sense. If an airport can only handle 60 flights per hour, then make each flight count for more. Simple math. Fewer flights, more passengers. Boeing's engineers were staring at the same data, but drawing a completely different conclusion. Passengers don't want to go through hubs. They don't want to fly from their hometown to Chicago, wait 3 hours, then catch another flight to Paris. They just want to get from point A to point B. So Boeing designed the 787 Dreamliner, a mid-sized, twin-engine, ultra-efficient plane built for one purpose: flying directly between cities that never had direct connections before. Not bigger, smarter. Airbus was designing for the airport. Boeing was designing for the passenger. Now let's talk numbers. Airbus poured roughly $25 billion into the A380. They needed to sell around 420 planes just to break even. 420. Remember that number. Boeing spent about $32 billion on the 787. Also a massive bet. But here's the crucial difference. Boeing had a much bigger potential market. Every airline in the world could use a fuel-efficient, long-range plane. The A380 only made sense for a handful of carriers with very specific network designs. The A380 worked in exactly 3 places: Dubai, Singapore, and Doha. What do they have in common? They're small places that built themselves into giant connecting hubs. Dubai International is essentially one enormous transfer station. Most passengers landing there aren't visiting Dubai. They're switching planes on their way from London to Sydney or Mumbai to New York. For this kind of operation, the A380 is actually brilliant. You funnel passengers from dozens of smaller flights into one massive aircraft heading to a major destination. Fill it up, send it off, repeat. Emirates understood this better than anyone. They ordered 123 A380s, nearly half of every single one ever built, and it worked beautifully because their entire business model was designed around one mega hub sitting at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. But America doesn't work that way. Not even close. Over 50 cities with more than 1 million people. Passengers scattered everywhere. American airlines don't have one hub. They have dozens. And thanks to deregulation back in 1978, the United States airline market is one of the most competitive on Earth. New York to Los Angeles has 8 different airlines slugging it out. Passengers care about one thing above all else: price. Luxury double-decker planes sound amazing until a budget carrier offers the same route for $200 less. This is where the 787 changed everything. It could make a profit on routes with only 150 or 200 passengers per day. Think about Austin, Texas. Are there 850 people who want to fly to Amsterdam on any given Tuesday? Absolutely not. Maybe 200. and that's exactly what a 787 needs. Suddenly, airlines could offer Austin to Amsterdam nonstop, Nashville to London nonstop, Portland to Tokyo nonstop. These routes would have been impossible with an A380. You'd be flying around with 600 empty seats. There's a technical detail that made this possible, and most people have never heard of it. Extended range twin-engine operations. Back in 1985, twin-engine planes had to stay within 60 minutes of the nearest airport. They basically couldn't cross oceans, but engines got absurdly reliable. By 2007, regulators approved twin-engine planes to fly up to 5.5 hours from the nearest airport. A plane with just 2 engines could now cross the Atlantic and Pacific on routes that previously required 4 engine giants. This single change pulled the rug out from under the A380's entire business case. And then there's what happens on the ground. An A380 needs special double-level boarding bridges, reinforced taxiways, and specially trained crews. Most American airports had maybe 2 or 4 gates that could handle one. A 737 turns around in 45 minutes. An A380 takes minimum 2 hours. During a busy afternoon at Chicago O'Hare, that one A380 gate could have handled 4 737 flights, moving just as many passengers with way more flexibility. American airports are built around speed and frequency. The A380 needed the opposite. So what happened? Boeing sold over 1,500 Dreamliners. Airlines from every continent lined up to buy them. Airbus sold 251 A380s total. They needed 420 to break even. By 2018, they were building maybe 8 per year when they needed 30. In 2019, they officially ended the program. So why did Airbus still pour $25 billion into the A380? Part of it was pride. The A380 was supposed to be the plane that finally broke Boeing's monopoly on the jumbo jet market. For decades, the 747 was the undisputed queen of the skies. Airbus wanted their own crown jewel, something that would make the world say, Airbus is number one. Part of it was a misread of how aviation would evolve. Airbus bet on a future where airports would get more congested, but the hub model would stay dominant. In that world, bigger planes make perfect sense. What they didn't predict was that airlines, especially American airlines, would abandon hub and spoke in favor of point-to-point routes connecting smaller cities directly. And part of it was Emirates. When Emirates placed that initial order for 58 planes in 2001, with options for 90 more, it was the biggest aircraft order in history. That kind of commitment from a prestigious airline can make any manufacturer feel validated. The problem was that Emirates' geography and business model were completely unique. What worked for Dubai didn't translate to Dallas. The 787 also made real improvements that every passenger could feel. Bigger windows you could dim electronically. Higher cabin pressure so you arrive less exhausted. Better humidity control. Smoother ride thanks to active turbulence dampening. These weren't first-class perks. These were improvements for every person on the plane. Meanwhile, the A380's luxury promise mostly lived in first class. In economy, the seat was basically the same as any other plane. Today, the legacy of this bet is everywhere. If you've ever taken a direct flight from a mid-size American city to somewhere in Europe or Asia, you're living in the world Boeing envisioned. Nashville to London, Denver to Tokyo, Austin to Frankfurt. None of these routes would exist without the 787. Meanwhile, the A380 is slowly disappearing from the skies. Emirates still flies them, and a few other airlines keep some in service, but no new ones will ever be built. Several carriers have already sent their A380s to the desert for storage or scrapping, some after barely a decade of service. Two companies looked at the exact same future and made opposite bets. Boeing bet on the passenger. Airbus bet on the system. The passenger won. That's a $25 billion lesson in understanding what your customer actually wants. And maybe the biggest irony? Airbus learned the lesson. Their A350 has been a massive success. They had the right answer in their back pocket the entire time. They just couldn't stop themselves from also chasing the wrong one. The next time you're on a direct flight from some mid-sized city to a destination halfway around the world, that flight exists because Boeing believed the future wasn't about building the biggest plane in the sky. It was about building the smartest one.
So, right now, the global airline industry burns about 8 million barrels of jet fuel every single day. That is roughly 120 billion gallons a year. And every gallon burned sends carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Aviation produces around 2.5% of all human CO2 emissions. That does not sound like a lot until you realize that if aviation were a country, it would rank as the 11th largest emitter on Earth, bigger than most nations. And here is the part that makes this problem different from almost every other industry. You cannot electrify an airplane, not a real one, not the kind that carries 200 people across an ocean. Batteries are too heavy. A fully electric 737 with current battery technology would need batteries that weigh more than the plane itself. Hydrogen is promising, but it requires completely new aircraft designs, new fuel storage systems, and new airport infrastructure. None of that exists at scale. None of it will, for decades. So if you cannot plug in a plane, and you cannot fill it with hydrogen, what do? You change the fuel. You keep the engines, the wings, the airports, everything. You just change what goes into the tank. That is the entire idea behind sustainable aviation fuel, SAF. And the aviation industry is betting hundreds of billions of dollars that it will work. So what actually is SAF? In simple terms, it is jet fuel that is not made from crude oil. Instead, it is made from things like used cooking oil, animal fats, agricultural waste, municipal garbage, and even carbon captured directly from the air. When it is burned, the CO2 it releases was recently absorbed by those source materials, not pulled from ancient underground reserves. On a life cycle basis, SAF can reduce carbon emissions by up to 80% compared to conventional jet fuel. And the critical part is this. SAF is what engineers call a drop-in fuel. It meets the same certification standards as regular jet fuel. It goes into the same tanks, flows through the same fuel lines, burns in the same engines. No modification to the aircraft, no changes at the airport. The plane does not know the difference. That is what makes SAF different from every other clean energy idea in aviation. It does not require the future. It works with what already exists today. So if SAF is real, and it works, and it reduces emissions by up to 80%, there is an obvious question. Why is less than 1% of the world's jet fuel sustainable? Because of the price. SAF currently costs 2 to 5 times more than conventional jet fuel. In the United States right now, regular jet fuel averages around $2.30 a gallon. SAF is closer to $6 to $8. In Europe, where governments have started mandating SAF blending, some airlines are paying up to 5 times the fossil fuel price. IATA estimates that airlines paid a combined $2.9 billion in premiums for SAF in 2025 alone, and they got less than 2 million tons of fuel for it. That is 0.6% of total global jet fuel consumption. Now think about the margins we talked about in a previous video. Airlines make about $7 per passenger. Their net margin is around 3.5%. Telling an airline to pay 3 to 5 times more for fuel
is not like asking someone to buy organic milk instead of regular. It is like asking them to set their entire business model on fire.
And the cost problem comes down to one thing: scale, or rather, the lack of it. Right now, about 82% of all SAF production uses a process called HEFA, which stands for hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids. What that really means is they are turning used cooking oil and animal fats into jet fuel. It works, it is proven, but there is a fundamental limit. There is only so much used cooking oil in the world. The US alone consumed about 3.3 billion pounds of collected used cooking oil in 2024. The biofuel industry needed 5.7 billion pounds. The math does not work. Demand already exceeds supply for the primary ingredient, and it gets more complicated. The biggest source of imported cooking oil for the US is China. In 2024, the US imported roughly 2.8 billion pounds of used cooking oil from China. When trade tensions escalate, tariffs go up, or regulations change, that supply chain can break overnight. You are trying to build the future of clean aviation on leftover fryer grease shipped across the Pacific. That is the situation right now. So if cooking oil cannot scale, what can? This is where the next generation of SAF technology comes in. Alcohol to jet converts ethanol into jet fuel. Fischer-Tropsch synthesis can turn municipal solid waste, forestry residue, and agricultural waste into fuel. And then there is the most ambitious pathway of all: power to liquid. You capture CO2 directly from the atmosphere, combine it with green hydrogen made from renewable electricity, and synthesize jet fuel from scratch, literally making fuel from air and water. The technology exists. The problem is that none of it is cheap. Power to liquid SAF can cost up to 12 times more than conventional jet fuel, and building the production facilities takes years. To hit the aviation industry's target of net zero by 2050, SAF production needs to go from 2 million tons a year to somewhere around 400 million tons. That is a 200 times increase in 25 years. And the investment required to build that capacity, the refineries, the feedstock supply chains, the distribution networks, is estimated at $1.5 to $2.4 trillion. That is not a typo. Trillions. So governments are stepping in, and they are doing it in very different ways. The European Union launched the Refuel EU aviation regulation, which mandates a minimum 2% SAF blend starting January 2025, scaling to 63% by 2050, with specific sub-targets for synthetic fuels. The UK introduced its own mandate alongside a revenue certainty mechanism, essentially guaranteeing SAF producers a fixed price for 15 years to de-risk their investment. The United States took a different approach. Under the Inflation Reduction Act, SAF producers can earn up to $1.75 per gallon in tax credits, and the Department of Energy issued nearly $3 billion in loan guarantees for scaling up production. But here is what is interesting. According to IATA, the mandates in Europe have not worked the way regulators hoped, because supply has not kept up with the mandated demand. Fuel suppliers have widened their profit margins. Airlines in Europe are paying up to 5 times the fossil jet fuel price, and the money is going to middlemen, not to building new production capacity. The production growth rate is actually slowing down. IATA projects SAF production in 2026 will reach just 2.4 million tons, which is 0.8% of total jet fuel consumption. So the mandates created demand, but they did not create supply. And without supply, all you get is higher costs. This is the central tension of the SAF story. Everyone agrees it is necessary. Airlines have committed to it. About 60 carriers have set specific SAF targets for 2030. Companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and DHL are buying SAF certificates to reduce their supply chain emissions. But the gap between ambition and reality is enormous. And there is one more thing that makes this different from other clean energy transitions. When solar panels got cheap, you could build a solar farm in a field. When electric cars took off, you built charging stations. The infrastructure adapted around the new technology. But SAF has to fit into an existing system that was built over decades specifically for fossil jet fuel. The refineries, the pipelines, the airport fuel systems, the global distribution network, all of it was designed for one thing. And SAF has to slot into it perfectly, or it does not work at all. That constraint is both its greatest advantage and its biggest bottleneck. Drop-in means no new airports, no new planes, but it also means you are competing for space inside a system that already works just fine for conventional fuel. You are not replacing an industry. You are trying to change it from the inside. So will it work? If production doubles every 2 years from where it is now, it would still take over 7 years to reach just 10% of total jet fuel from sustainable sources. The industry's own target is for SAF to contribute about 65% of the emissions reduction needed to hit net zero by 2050. That means going from 0.6% of fuel supply to being the majority of it in 25 years. History shows that energy transitions at this scale are possible. Solar energy went from less than 1% of global electricity in 2010 to over 5% by 2023. But solar had something SAF does not. Costs dropped 90% in a decade because the technology improved with scale. SAF costs are falling, but much more slowly, because the bottleneck is not the technology, it is the feedstock. You cannot make used cooking oil cheaper by building more factories. You need entirely new production pathways to open up. And those pathways are still in early development. What is most likely is a messy middle. SAF production will grow, but not fast enough to hit the targets on schedule. Costs will come down, but not as fast as anyone wants. Airlines will absorb some of the premium and pass the rest to passengers. Your ticket will get slightly more expensive. And the gap between what the industry promised and what it actually delivers will become one of the defining tensions in aviation over the next decade. But here is what is easy to miss in all the skepticism. In 2020, global SAF production was essentially zero. By 2024, it hit 1 million tons. By 2025, nearly 2 million. It doubled in a single year. The EU and UK mandates are now law. Hundreds of production projects are in development. Airlines are signing long-term supply contracts worth billions. It is not fast enough, but it is not nothing. The aviation industry moves 5 billion passengers a year. It cannot stop flying. It cannot electrify. It cannot switch to hydrogen tomorrow. SAF is the only option that works right now with the planes and airports we already have. The question was never whether SAF would happen. It was always whether it would happen fast enough. And that question is still open.